He stood at the altar surrounded by England's most breathtaking women, and he turned his back on every single one of them. The Duke of Ashbourne didn't hesitate, didn't apologize, didn't explain. He walked across that crowded ballroom past diamonds and silk and perfume, straight toward a woman standing alone in a plain gray dress, a woman no one had even bothered to learn the name of. And in front of all of England's nobility, he said 4 words that changed everything. I choose her, tonight. If this story already has your heart, subscribe, hit that bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and it did not ask, it commanded. Eleanor Hartwell was standing at the kitchen table when the courier knocked, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands dusted with flour from the bread she'd been making since 5 in the morning. She was not expecting anything. No one wrote to her. No one thought of her. That was simply the shape of her life, and she had long since stopped grieving it. She wiped her hands on her apron, opened the door, and took the envelope. Heavy cream paper, a wax seal pressed with a crest she didn't recognize at first glance. Her name written in careful, formal script across the front. Miss Eleanor Hartwell, private and urgent. She turned it over twice before she opened it. The letter was from a man named Mr. Aldous Prentice, solicitor, representing the estate of Nathaniel James Whitmore, the 5th Duke of Ashbourne. She read it once. Then she sat down and read it again. His Grace required a meeting, a matter of significant personal importance. A carriage would be dispatched the following morning should she consent to attend. All travel arrangements were to be provided. Her answer was requested by end of day. Eleanor set the letter flat on the table and stared at it for a long moment. Then she went back to her bread dough. She finished kneading it. She covered it with a cloth and left it to rise. She washed her hands at the basin. She checked on her mother, who was sleeping again, which she did more often now than not. She came back downstairs, made tea, and sat with the letter again. She had heard of the Duke of Ashbourne, of course. Everyone had. The newspapers had been full of him for the better part of 3 months. The inheritance clause, the deadline, the parade of eligible noblewomen being presented to him at one glittering event after another. There had even been a small illustration in one of the society papers, the Duke standing at the edge of a ballroom expressionless, while women in extraordinary gowns angled themselves to catch his eye. He had looked, from what little she could read in that illustration, like a man who would rather be anywhere else. She understood the feeling. She had not been to a ball in 6 years. She had not been to anything. She had been here in this house with her mother's medicines and her father's debts and the accounts that never quite balanced, no matter how carefully she managed them. She was 27 years old, and she was tired in the particular way that only comes from carrying too much for too long without anyone noticing the weight. She wrote her answer and sent it back with the courier before noon. I consent to attend. The carriage arrived the next morning before she'd finished her tea. It was a finer vehicle than anything that had ever stopped on their lane. The horses were matched chestnuts, glossy and perfectly behaved. The footman who opened the door had better clothes than anything in Eleanor's wardrobe. She brought one bag, a dress that was clean and pressed and as respectable as anything she owned. Her mother had been settled with the neighbor's daughter who came in 3 mornings a week. Eleanor had left instructions for everything. She had a talent for leaving instructions. The ride to Ashbourne Hall took the better part of 4 hours. She spent them looking out the window and thinking very precisely about what she was and was not prepared to agree to. She was not naive. She understood why a solicitor representing a duke in need of a wife within a legal deadline might reach beyond the usual circles of society. She understood that she was not the first name on anyone's list. She was at best a practical solution to an inconvenient problem. She told herself she did not mind that. She had learned over the years to be practical about what she was to people. Ashbourne Hall appeared around a long curving drive, and it was exactly as imposing as she'd expected. Stone, columns, windows that caught the pale autumn light, grounds that stretched farther than her eye could follow. She did not gasp. She did not press her face to the carriage glass. She simply looked catalogued and made note of the fact that the east wing guttering needed repair, and one of the garden walls had a visible crack running through the lower mortar. She stepped out of the carriage when the footman offered his hand. Mr. Prentice met her at the entrance. He was a thin man of perhaps 60, with careful eyes and an expression that had learned not to give anything away. He shook her hand as surprise. Most solicitors bowed to women rather than shook their hands and led her inside without preamble. "His Grace is in the library," he said. "He prefers to conduct important conversations there. He finds drawing rooms theatrical." "And does he often say so?" Eleanor asked. Mr. Prentice glanced at her sideways. "More often than is comfortable, Miss Hartwell." She almost smiled. The library was at the back of the house, dark wood, high shelves, the smell of old paper, and something faintly like wood smoke and cold air. The windows were tall and looked out onto the back garden gray now in the November light. The Duke was standing at one of those windows with his back to the door when she entered. He was taller than she expected, broader in the shoulders. He turned when he heard the door, and she had a moment to look at him before he looked at her. A square jaw, dark eyes set under serious brows, a mouth that appeared to have forgotten how to rest in any expression other than careful neutrality. He was not quite handsome. He was something more than that and less than it. At the same time, the kind of face that became more interesting the longer you looked at it. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Hartwell?" "Your Grace." He gestured toward a chair. She sat. He did not sit. He stood at a slight distance, hands behind his back, and regarded her with the focused attention of someone conducting an inspection. She let him look. She had nothing to hide and nothing to perform. "You know why you're here," he said. It was not a question. "You require a wife," she said. "Your solicitor's letter was clear enough. Then you understand the nature of the arrangement." "I understand there is a deadline," she said, "and a legal condition attached to your inheritance, and that you have not found a satisfactory candidate among the usual options." Something flickered in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like recalibration. "You are very direct," he said. "Would you prefer I wasn't?" A pause. "No," he said. "I would not." He moved then not closer, just slightly differently, as if he had shifted some internal footing. He sat finally in the chair across from her and leaned forward with his forearms on his knees. "I have spent 3 months attending events I found excruciating," he said, "being introduced to women who smiled too much and said too little, or said exactly what they'd rehearsed and believed I couldn't tell the difference. I need a wife, Miss Hartwell, not a performance." "And what exactly do you believe I am?" she said carefully, "if not a last resort?" He didn't flinch. She gave him credit for that. "You were recommended to me," he said, "by a man who has known your family for 20 years. He described you as someone with an extraordinary capacity for management, genuine composure, under pressure, and absolutely no interest in impressing people who don't matter." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "He is a kind man," she said. "He has also perhaps overstated. He told me. The Duke said that when your father died and left your family with debts no one knew about. You were 22 years old. You did not panic. You did not ask for rescue, and you spent the next 2 years quietly and methodically solving the problem without once complaining to anyone who might have helped you out of pride." She had not expected that. She sat very still. "Is it accurate?" he asked. "More or less," she said finally. "Then I have not overstated anything," he said. "I have been looking for someone sensible, someone real, someone who understands that a household is not a stage, and that marriage at its core is a partnership between two people who choose to be honest with each other." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "You are describing a business arrangement," she said. "Yes," he said, "I am." "And what do you offer," she said, "beyond the title?" He blinked. She had the impression she had just asked a question no one had ever thought to put to him directly. "Security," he said after a moment. Financial stability, a home, freedom to manage the household as you see fit, respect, and my word, which I do not give lightly and do not break. Eleanor was quiet again. And children, she said. He held her gaze. The inheritance requires an heir. Yes, that is part of the arrangement. And if... She stopped. She chose her words. And if the arrangement were to become something other than an arrangement, if it were to become something more, would that be permissible? In your view? He was very still. I don't know, he said finally. And it was the most honest thing he had said. She stood up. He looked up at her surprised. I need to walk, she said. I think better when I walk. Do you mind? He stood because she was standing. Old habit. No, he said, somewhat bewildered. She walked to the nearest bookshelf and stood in front of it, her back half to him, her eyes moving along the spines, without really reading them. My mother is ill, she said. She needs specific medicines and a particular schedule of care. That would need to be arranged. Done, he said. I would want to manage the household according to my own judgment, not subject to approval for every decision. Agreed. I will not pretend to be something I am not for society, not for your guests, not for you. A pause. I would not ask you to. She turned around. You should understand, she said, that I will not love you out of gratitude. If I come to love you at all, it will be because you've earned it. And if I never do, I will still honor every commitment I make. But I want you to know the difference. I want you to know that I am not someone who can be purchased into devotion. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said quietly. I can see that. She left Ashbourne Hall that afternoon with nothing settled and nothing promised. She told herself on the carriage ride home that she had likely just refused the most significant opportunity of her life through sheer stubbornness. She told herself she had done the right thing by being honest. She told herself she was not thinking about the way he had said, I don't know, not as a deflection, but as a real answer from a man who had apparently forgotten how to give them. She arrived home to find her mother awake and asking for her. She made tea. She read aloud for an hour. She watched her mother fall asleep again, and then she sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, not thinking about anything in particular. The next morning, a second letter arrived. This one was not from the solicitor. It was in a different hand. Firmer, more deliberate, like a man who pressed harder on the pen than was strictly necessary. Miss Hartwell, I have been thinking about what you said, specifically about the difference between gratitude and love, and why it matters to name it. I find I cannot argue with your position. I would like to make a second offer if you will permit me. Not the same one. A better one. I am asking you to come back to Ashbourne, not because I require a wife, but because I believe you are someone worth knowing. I understand if that is insufficient. But I thought you deserved to hear it said plainly. N. Whitmore. Eleanor read it 3 times. Then she wrote back, I will come on Thursday. The second visit was different. He met her at the door himself. No Mr. Prentice. No formal staging. He was in slightly less formal clothes. She noticed that immediately, and he walked with her directly into the library again, but this time the chairs were angled differently. Closer together. More like a conversation than an audience. He had books pulled off the shelf, left open face down like someone who'd actually been reading them. He offered her tea himself, which surprised the maid who had appeared with a tray and found she was not needed. I wanted to tell you something, he said before she could speak, about why I have not found anyone suitable. I assumed it was because... It wasn't about the women, he said. Most of them were perfectly good. Several were genuinely impressive. The problem was me. She waited. I was engaged once, he said. 7 years ago. She was everything society would have chosen for me. Accomplished, beautiful, well-connected. We were together for 8 months. He paused. She was also in love with someone else the entire time, and using our engagement to make him jealous. When he finally offered for her, she ended our arrangement in a letter. 3 sentences. No apology. Eleanor said nothing. "I don't tell you this for sympathy," he said quickly. "I tell you because you were honest with me, and it seemed wrong to be less than honest with you. I have been cautious since then, overly cautious perhaps. I built this house into something very ordered and very silent, because I preferred order and silence to the alternative." "The alternative being feeling something," she said. He looked at her sharply. "Yes," he said. "That. And now," he let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, but wasn't quite. "And now I have met someone who told me to my face that she will not love me out of gratitude, and I find I respect that more than any performance of affection I have ever been offered." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "That is a strange thing to build a marriage on." "Perhaps," he said. "But it might also be the only honest foundation I've ever been given the option of." She picked up her tea. She looked out the window at the gray garden below, at the crack in the far wall she'd noticed on her first visit. "That wall needs repointing," she said. "Before the winter freezes the crack wider." He stared at her. "The east wing guttering as well," she said. "If it isn't cleared before the rains come properly, you'll have water damage behind the fascia, and that becomes expensive very quickly." He continued to stare. "I notice things," she said simply. "I always have. It's a habit from managing a household on very little. You learn to see the small things before they become large ones." He was quiet for a moment. "Will you stay for dinner?" he said. She stayed for dinner, and then she stayed to help with a sudden crisis in the kitchen when the cook's daughter arrived in tears over a ruined pudding for a staff dinner that evening. Eleanor did not make a production of it. She simply went downstairs, assessed the situation, proposed a solution that was simpler and faster, and had the problem resolved in 20 minutes. She came back upstairs to find the Duke standing at the bottom of the main staircase looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "But I was there, and I could, so I did." He walked with her to the door himself when her carriage came. It was well past 8 in the evening, later than she'd intended. "Miss Hartwell," he said at the door. She turned. "If I asked you again formally to consider the arrangement we discussed, but different, with full knowledge of what I told you today, would you—" "Yes," she said. He blinked. "You didn't let me finish." "You were going to ask if I would consider becoming your wife," she said. "And the answer is yes. I've thought about it thoroughly." He looked at her for a long, strange moment. "When?" he asked. "When did I decide, or when can it happen?" "When did you decide?" She considered. "Somewhere between the pudding crisis and the east wing guttering," she said. And then before he could respond, she stepped into the carriage. She did not look back, but she was for the first time in a very long time almost smiling. Word traveled through the county like wildfire through dry summer grass. The Duke of Ashbourne had chosen. Not Lady Pemberton's daughter, who was considered one of the great beauties of the season. Not Miss Cavendish, whose fortune was immense and whose social connections were the envy of every mother in 3 counties. Not the Honorable Miss Fairfax, who had been so certain of her position that she had already begun describing her future role as Duchess to her intimate friends. The Duke had chosen Eleanor Hartwell, a nobody, a country scholar's daughter with no money, no connections, no notable beauty, and no obvious qualification for the role she was about to assume. The news arrived in drawing rooms and dining rooms and ladies' parlors and set off a cascade of disbelief that took nearly a week to exhaust itself. "He cannot be serious," said Lady Cavendish to her husband. "He sent the formal notice to the solicitors," her husband replied. "He is apparently very serious." "But she has no— How is she even—" "She apparently told him something about East Wing guttering," said Lord Cavendish, and went back to his newspaper, which he found more interesting than most of his wife's social crises. At the Pemberton estate, Lord Pemberton's daughter sat in her bedroom for an entire afternoon and did not come down for dinner. At the Fairfax house, the Honorable Miss Fairfax burned 2 letters she had already begun drafting to friends detailing her future life at Ashbourne Hall. And at a small country house with a cracked front step and a kitchen that smelled of bread, Eleanor Hartwell sat down with her mother and explained as carefully and calmly as she could what was about to happen. Her mother was quiet for a long time after. Then she reached out and took Eleanor's hand. "He sees you," her mother said. Eleanor looked at her. "Most people don't," her mother said. "You've spent so long making yourself useful and quiet and easy to overlook. You've learned to take up so little space." She squeezed Eleanor's hand. "He sees you. That is not nothing, my love. That is, in fact, almost everything." Eleanor did not cry. She had learned not to cry. It was one of the things she had trained out of herself over the years, because tears were a luxury she hadn't been able to afford. But something shifted in her chest, quiet and significant, like a window being opened in a room that has been closed for too long. "I don't know him well enough yet to love him," she said. "No?" her mother agreed. "But I think—" She stopped. "I think he's the kind of man who is worth the effort of knowing." Her mother smiled. "Then that's enough to begin with." Here, the announcement appeared in the newspapers 3 days later. And in every parlor and drawing room where polished women in expensive dresses read it, and felt the particular sting of being outmaneuvered by someone they had already decided not to take seriously. A new thought, sharp and uncomfortable, began to surface. What had Eleanor Hartwell said to him? What had she done? What did she have this plain, quiet, unfashionable country woman that none of them had managed to offer in 3 months of carefully executed attempts? They would spend a long time wondering. They would never quite figure it out. Because the answer was the one thing none of them had thought to try. She had simply been real. And for a man who had spent years surrounded by performance, that was the most extraordinary thing he had ever encountered. The wedding was on a Thursday, not a Saturday, which was what society expected. Not a grand ceremony in St. George's, Hanover Square, where half of England's nobility came to be seen getting married. Not in the spring when the flowers were right and the light was flattering and the whole event could be staged for maximum impression. A Thursday, in November, in the small stone chapel on the eastern edge of the Ashbourne estate, with 12 people in attendance, and no flowers, except the ones Eleanor had arranged herself from the greenhouse that morning. She had not asked permission to use the greenhouse. She had simply gone there at first light, chosen what she wanted, and brought them back. When Nathaniel heard about it later from the groundskeeper, he did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Did she ask where things were?" "No, Your Grace. She found everything herself." He nodded slowly. "Good," he said. And he meant it, though he couldn't quite explain why. The ceremony lasted 40 minutes. Eleanor wore a dress that was cream-colored and well-made and utterly without ornamentation. Her hair was pinned neatly. She carried a small bouquet of late-season white roses she had cut herself. She walked down the aisle on the arm of Mr. Aldous Prentice, who had agreed to stand in because there was no male relative to perform the duty, and Eleanor had refused to pretend the situation was something it wasn't. She arrived at Nathaniel's side and looked at him directly. He was wearing his best coat and looking like a man who had decided to face something rather than avoid it. "You look calm," he said quietly before the ceremony began. "I am calm," she said. "How?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "Because I've made a decision I believe in," she said. "Fear comes from uncertainty. I'm not uncertain." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "I wish I could say the same," he said. She glanced at him. "Which part are you uncertain about?" "Whether I'll deserve this," he said. It was such an unguarded thing to say that Eleanor almost reached for his hand before the vicar had even opened his book. She stopped herself, but it was a near thing. The ceremony proceeded. When it was done, and the register was signed, and Mr. Prentice had shaken both their hands with visible relief, Eleanor turned to her new husband. "Well," she said, Well, he agreed. I suppose we should go home. He looked slightly startled by the word, home. Like he'd forgotten that's what it was supposed to be. Yes, he said. I suppose we should. They walked out of the chapel into the pale November air, and there was no crowd, no applause, no shower of rice or flower petals. Just the sound of their own footsteps on the gravel path, and the distant cawing of rooks somewhere in the bare trees, and the strange full silence of two people who have just made a permanent decision and are only beginning to understand what it means. The servants of Ashbourne Hall were assembled in the entrance hall when they returned. 14 people, ranging from the elderly housekeeper Mrs. Fairfax, who had been at Ashbourne for 31 years and had survived 3 dukes, to a 12-year-old hall boy named Albert, who was so nervous he was visibly shaking. Eleanor looked at each of them in turn as Nathaniel introduced them. She didn't nod and move on. She stopped at each person. She repeated their name. She asked one question, just one that was specific to each of them. She asked the cook, Mrs. Doyle, whether the kitchen required anything it currently lacked. She asked the head groom about the horses by name. She asked Albert the hall boy whether he'd had his lunch. He hadn't. She turned to Mrs. Fairfax and said quietly but clearly, "Could you see that he does? Growing boys shouldn't work hungry." Mrs. Fairfax stared at her for a fraction of a second longer than protocol required. Then she said, "Of course, Your Grace." And there was something in her voice that had not been there 30 seconds earlier. Nathaniel stood slightly back and watched all of this. He had managed his staff with fairness and efficiency for 6 years. He had never thought to ask Albert if he'd had lunch. When the staff dispersed, he said, "You remembered every name." "I always remember names," she said matter-of-factly, already looking toward the corridor that led to the east wing. "Can I see the household accounts today? Or would tomorrow be more convenient? Today is..." He paused. "Eleanor, it's our wedding day." She turned around. "I'm aware of that," she said. "I'm also aware that efficient household management requires a full accounting of the current situation before changes can be implemented. I assumed you would want me to begin as I mean to go on." He looked at her for a long moment. "You find managing a household comforting," he said. It wasn't an insult. It was a genuine observation. She considered it honestly. "When things are uncertain," she said, "I focus on what I can control. The accounts are something I can control." "And what's uncertain?" She looked at him steadily. "Everything else," she said. "Us. This house. What we become. That part I can't manage into order. So I'll start with the accounts." He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "I'll have Prentice bring them to the library at 3. "Thank you." She started walking. Then she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "Nathaniel." It was the first time she had used his name without his title. They both noticed. "Thank you," she said, "for not making this something it isn't. The small ceremony, no performance. I know there was probably pressure to do otherwise." "There was considerable pressure," he said. "I didn't much care." "I know," she said. "That's part of why I said yes." She walked away. He stood in the entrance hall, alone for a moment, looking at the space where she'd been standing. Then he went to tell Prentice about the accounts. By the end of her first week at Ashbourne Hall, Eleanor had identified 11 separate problems with household management that had been quietly compounding for years. Not through malice, through neglect, through the particular kind of neglect that comes from a person running an institution while paying more attention to its exterior than its interior. She didn't announce the problems. She didn't present the Duke with a list. She simply began quietly and methodically to address them. The elderly undergardener, who had been struggling with a knee injury for months, was reassigned to lighter work without fanfare. The problem with the kitchen supply invoices, where a small but consistent discrepancy had been accumulating for over a year, was identified traced to a misunderstanding rather than dishonesty, and corrected with a revised accounting system. The housemaid's schedule was adjusted so that the heaviest work was distributed more evenly rather than falling disproportionately on the two youngest girls. She found out what time the staff ate their meals. She found out that two of the upper rooms were not being properly aired because the key to the linen cupboard on the third floor had been missing for 8 months and no one had replaced it. She replaced it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax, came to find Eleanor on the 5th day. She was a tall woman with iron gray hair and 31 years of practiced dignity. She had, Eleanor suspected, been prepared to be polite and manageable, and to wait for this new duchess to lose interest in the details. Mrs. Fairfax stood in the doorway of the small sitting room Eleanor had claimed as a working space and said, "Your Grace, I wanted to speak to you directly if I may." "Please sit down," Eleanor said without looking up from what she was writing. Mrs. Fairfax sat. She straightened her spine. "I have served this household under 3 dukes," she said. "I have—" She stopped. She tried again. "I want you to know that what you did for Thomas the undergardener and the way you spoke to the staff on your first day, it was—" She stopped again. Eleanor looked up. Mrs. Fairfax's expression had cracked just slightly at the edges. "It was the first time in many years," she said carefully, "that anyone in this house has treated the staff as though it mattered whether we were well." Eleanor set her pen down. "It does matter," she said simply. "A household runs on the people inside it, not on the floors or the silver or the drapes. If the people are not well, nothing else will be either." Mrs. Fairfax looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need from me, Your Grace? Not what's on the written list. What do you actually need?" And that was the beginning of an alliance that would shape Ashbourne Hall for the next 20 years. Nathaniel noticed the changes before he understood what was causing them. Breakfast was somehow better. Not the food. Mrs. Doyle had always been a competent cook, but the atmosphere, the timing was smoother. The small irritations that had accumulated unnoticed over years, things running slightly wrong, silences that felt like problems rather than peace, were disappearing one by one. He found himself arriving at breakfast earlier than he used to, which was strange because he had previously considered the meal a function rather than an experience. Eleanor was always already there. She was invariably doing something, reading, writing in her household journal, corresponding with someone. She would look up when he came in, say good morning, and go back to whatever she was doing, and somehow that absence of performance was more welcoming than any deliberate effort would have been. He started talking to her at breakfast. Not about anything significant at first. Tenants, weather, something he'd read. She would respond sometimes briefly, sometimes at length, and she always said something that made him think, rather than simply giving him the agreeable noise he was accustomed to receiving from people who wanted something. One morning, 3 weeks after the wedding, he said something about a disputed fence line between 2 tenant families that had been causing trouble for months. And Eleanor put down her pen and said, "Has anyone spoken to the Hartley family directly about the original survey? The Hartley family is what makes you think, because from what you've described, they're the ones who've been on that land longest, and people who've been somewhere longest usually know where the original boundaries were, even if they can't produce documentation. And because you said the other family moved into the tenancy 8 years ago, which is after your father died, and before you took over the estate, which means there was probably a period where oversight was loose and someone made a decision about land use that wasn't properly recorded." He stared at her. "I'm guessing," she said, "but it seems worth asking." He asked. She was right. The dispute was resolved in a week after years of festering. He told her so at breakfast, and she said, "Good, what's the next one?" and refilled her own tea without ceremony. He started bringing her other problems after that. Not the trivial ones. He'd learned very quickly that she had no patience for things that could be resolved without her, but the ones that had been knotted up for years, the ones where he'd felt the friction but couldn't find the thread. She found threads. That was what she did. She pulled on them gently and carefully until things came loose. He started to wonder if she could do the same with him. He immediately told himself that was not a productive line of thought. The first society dinner came at the end of November. Lord and Lady Dunmore were hosting, as they did every year, a gathering of the county's significant families. An invitation had been sent to Ashbourne Hall, as it was every year, and Nathaniel had written to decline as he did every year. This year, Eleanor intercepted the decline before it was sent. She came to find him in his study. "We should go," she said. He looked up. "To the Dunmore dinner." "Yes, I don't attend the Dunmore dinner." "I know, that's part of why we should go." He set down his pen. "Eleanor, these events are necessary," she said. "Not pleasant. There's a difference." She sat down in the chair across from his desk, which she always did. Without asking a habit, he had privately stopped minding 3 days into the marriage. "You are a duke with an estate that depends on the goodwill of a network of people. Your absence from that network has been tolerated because you are who you are. It will not be tolerated indefinitely. And your new wife, who no one has met and everyone has opinions about, needs to be seen, not to impress anyone, but to remove the ammunition their opinions are currently carrying. They will try to embarrass you," he said. "Yes. Some of them are quite good at it." "I imagine they are." She met his eyes. "Nathaniel, I have managed creditors and county officials, and men who believed that because they were louder than me, they were also smarter than me. I have argued estate debts in front of men who thought a woman in that room was a clerical error. I have been underestimated in every possible configuration." She paused. "I'm not afraid of Lady Dunmore's dinner party." He looked at her for a long, measuring moment. "All right," he said. "Thank you. If it becomes unbearable, I'll tell you directly," she said. "And we'll leave." Most people would say, "We can leave early," and mean, "I will endure it stoically," and then be unpleasant about it in the carriage afterwards. "I know," she said. "I'm not most people." He almost smiled. He turned it into something more neutral before it fully formed, but she saw it anyway. She noticed things. She always noticed things. May. The Dunmore dinner was everything Eleanor had expected and exactly as dangerous as Nathaniel had implied. Lady Dunmore was a woman of 60, with the particular social precision of someone who had spent 4 decades perfecting the art of the cutting remark delivered in a tone of perfect kindness. She greeted Eleanor with a smile that reached neither of her eyes and said, "My dear, how lovely. We have all been so curious about you." "I hope I'm not a disappointment," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Oh, but how could you be?" said Lady Dunmore. We expected someone quite different, I'll admit, given the circumstances." "Given the circumstances." Eleanor agreed with exactly the same pleasant expression. Lady Dunmore paused for a fraction of a second. She was used to people filling silences. Eleanor did not fill silences. "You must find Ashbourne rather overwhelming," said a younger woman nearby Miss Carver. Eleanor would learn who had been included on Nathaniel's original list of candidates and had been visibly not pleased to discover this. Such a large house to manage, and so suddenly. "I find it manageable," Eleanor said. "But surely you've had to lean heavily on Mrs. Fairfax. She's really the one who keeps the house running." "Mrs. Fairfax is invaluable," Eleanor said. "We work very well together." "Together?" Miss Carver's voice held the precise edge of someone probing for a weakness. "Of course you would have had no experience with a house on that scale before." "No," Eleanor said. "I've had experience with houses where the margin for error was essentially nothing, where a single miscalculation could mean the difference between keeping the lights on and losing everything. I find that Ashbourne, with its considerable resources, is in some ways simpler to manage." She smiled. "Though I'll grant you the scale does take some adjustment." Miss Carver opened her mouth, closed it. A man to Eleanor's left. Lord Felton, she would later learn a man of sharp intelligence, who pretended to be primarily interested in horses, turned toward her with sudden attention. "Where did you learn to manage like that?" he asked. "Necessity," she said. "The best teacher," he said. "The only one that actually sticks," she said. Felton laughed genuinely and unexpectedly, and turned to make a comment to the man beside him, and the conversation shifted in the way that conversations do when someone has said the true and interesting thing instead of the expected one. Nathaniel was 6 feet away throughout all of this, speaking to Lord Dunmore about something agricultural and watching Eleanor from the corner of his vision with the focused attention of a man trying very hard to look like he was paying attention to something else. She did not need him to intervene. She did not look to him for rescue. She held her own ground in a room full of people who had decided before she arrived that she didn't belong in it, and she did it without performing, without straining, without a single thing that was not simply authentically herself. He had thought she was brave in an abstract way when she'd agreed to come. He understood now that it wasn't bravery. Bravery required fear. Eleanor simply didn't give those people enough power over her to be afraid of them. He found that unexpectedly almost painful to witness, because it meant she had learned it, not from confidence, from practice, from years and years of not mattering to the people in the room and having to function anyway. He thought about that on the carriage ride home and said nothing. Eleanor, for her part, was quiet too. Not the strained quiet of someone managing something difficult, the settled quiet of someone who has spent a full evening doing what was required and is now simply returning to herself. "Lord Felton," she said eventually, "is much sharper than he wants people to believe." "He's been managing it for 20 years, Nathaniel said. "He finds it useful that people underestimate him." "I understand the strategy," she said. A pause. Then, "You were remarkable tonight." She looked at him. "I was functional." "You were remarkable," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression that she didn't quite manage to neutralize before he saw it. "Thank you," she said quietly. They rode the rest of the way in silence. But it was a different kind of silence than before. Warmer, slightly smaller. The distance between them had closed by something too subtle to measure and too significant to ignore. Then came the letter. It arrived on a gray December morning addressed to Nathaniel from a man named Geoffrey Calder. Geoffrey Calder was Nathaniel's cousin, the one who stood to inherit Ashbourne Hall if the conditions of the title were not met. The one who gambled, the one who drank, the one who had already destroyed 2 smaller family properties through spectacular mismanagement and shown absolutely no remorse about either. Eleanor didn't know the details of the letter, but she knew something had happened because Nathaniel did not appear at breakfast, which was the first time in 3 weeks that he had missed it, and when she passed his study at mid-morning, the door was closed, and she could hear faintly through the wood the particular sound of someone who is sitting very still and thinking very hard. She knocked. A pause. "Yes." She opened the door. He was at his desk and the letter was in front of him, and his expression was the one she was beginning to recognize as his version of a storm completely controlled on the surface, considerable pressure underneath. "What's happened?" she said. "Nothing urgent," he said. His voice was level, practiced. She looked at him for a moment. Then she came in, closed the door behind her, and sat in the chair across from his desk. The one she always sat in. "Nathaniel," she said, "we agreed to be honest with each other." He was quiet. "I can see from here that whatever is in that letter has upset you significantly," she said. "You do not have to tell me the specifics if you don't want to. But you should know that I am not going to pretend I didn't notice, and I am not going to leave you alone with it out of politeness." He looked at the letter. Then he looked at her. "It's from Geoffrey," he said. She waited. "He has written to inform me with what he clearly considers to be considerable wit that he has heard our marriage was an unremarkable affair, that the woman I chose is clearly a placeholder, that he gives the arrangement 6 months before it collapses, at which point he intends to be positioned and ready." A muscle moved in his jaw. He also wrote that he hopes I find the arrangement satisfactory. He underlined the word. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "He is trying to provoke you." "He is succeeding," Nathaniel said with flat honesty, "because he is wrong about us, or because he's touched something else." He looked at her sharply. She held his gaze. She didn't retreat from the question. "Both," he said finally. He called you a placeholder. His voice went quieter. You are not. Whatever this is or isn't, you are not a placeholder. I will not have that said about you. The word landed in the room between them. Whatever this is or isn't. Eleanor looked at him carefully. That was the first part, she said. What's the second part? What else did he touch? A long pause. He's right that I chose you because it was safe, Nathaniel said. Not because you are safe. You are in fact not remotely safe, as I am increasingly discovering, but because I told myself that a practical arrangement was safe, that wanting nothing meant there was nothing to lose. And now, she said. He looked at her directly. And now I am standing in a position I didn't plan for, he said. And I am not sure whether that is a problem or not. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. Then she said, It isn't a problem, Nathaniel. It is simply where we are. She stood. Write back to Jeffrey if you want to, or don't. It won't change what happens here. She paused at the door. And for the record, he is going to be waiting a very long time for this to collapse. He doesn't know what we're built on. She left. The door clicked softly behind her. Nathaniel sat for a long moment looking at the empty chair. Then he picked up Jeffrey's letter, folded it precisely in half, and put it in the fireplace. He didn't write back. He didn't need to. Christmas came quietly to Ashbourne Hall. Nathaniel had not celebrated it properly since his parents died. There had been trees and the appropriate gestures, but nothing that could be honestly called a celebration. It had become a day like other days, slightly inconvenient for its disruption of routine. Eleanor changed that without discussing it with him first. He came downstairs on Christmas morning to find that the hall had been decorated not extravagantly but warmly. Greenery from the estate. Candles. A smell from the kitchen that he hadn't encountered since he was a child, and that hit him somewhere behind the sternum before he could prepare for it. He stood in the hall and just stopped. Mrs. Fairfax appeared from the direction of the kitchen. She looked at his expression and said simply, Her Grace was up at 5 o'clock. He stood there for another moment. Then he found Eleanor in the small sitting room, arranging something on the mantelpiece, her back to the door. You didn't ask me, he said. She turned. No, she agreed. Why not? Because you would have said it wasn't necessary, she said. And you would have been wrong. He looked at the room. He looked at her. Eleanor? It's Christmas, she said quietly. It should feel like something. You've had enough years of it feeling like nothing. He was very quiet for a moment. How do you know that? He said. Because you don't notice your own silences, she said. But other people do. He stood in the doorway of the room she had made warm in the house that had been empty for years, and something moved in him, not dramatically, not with the force of a revelation. Something slower. Something more like a return. He crossed the room. He sat in the chair nearest the fire. He said, Sit with me. She sat. They didn't say anything for a while. But for the first time in a very long time, the silence at Ashbourne Hall felt like rest rather than absence. And Eleanor, looking at him, without looking like she was looking, thought, There you are. Not as a triumph, not as a discovery, simply as a recognition. As if something that had been on its way for a while had finally arrived. January arrived with teeth. The cold that settled over Ashbourne in the first week of the new year was the kind that got into the bones of old stone houses and stayed there. It came with wind off the northern fields, and frost that cracked the ground, and a particular gray quality to the light that made mornings feel like they hadn't quite decided to start yet. Eleanor noticed the cold in the village before she noticed it anywhere else. She had begun sometime in late December, making regular visits to the estate's tenant families. Not official inspections, not anything that required announcement. She simply went. She took note of things. She spoke to people. She listened, which was a skill most people with power had lost or never developed, and she had understood for years that listening was where the real information lived. What she heard in January troubled her. 3 families in the furthest cluster of tenant cottages were struggling in ways that had nothing to do with the ordinary hardship of winter. A fever had started, not severe at first, the kind of thing that people managed without calling for help, because calling for help cost money and pride and time. But it had moved from one household to another with the quiet efficiency of illness that has found favorable conditions, and by the second week of January it had worked its way through 4 households and showed no signs of stopping. She heard about it from Mrs. Croft, who came to the hall twice a week to assist with the laundry. Mrs. Croft mentioned it the way working people mention disaster sideways, not as a complaint, because complaint implies expectation of help, and expectation of help had been trained out of generations of people in positions like hers. "The Hollis children are bad with it," she said, not looking up from the sheets she was folding. "And the old Penwick man." Eleanor looked at her directly. "How long?" "Coming on 2 weeks for some." "Has the doctor been sent for?" A pause that said everything. "It's a long way, Your Grace." Eleanor was in her coat and out the door within the hour. She found what she'd expected, and worse. Overcrowded rooms and inadequate heat, and people trying to manage sickness with resources that weren't equal to the task. The Hollis children, 3 of them ranging in age from 4 to 11, were genuinely ill, not just unwell. The 4-year-old had a fever that Eleanor recognized as dangerous the moment she put her hand to the child's forehead. She did not hesitate. She sent the eldest Hollis child, who was 11 and steady, to the hall with a note for Mrs. Fairfax. She stayed. She sent for the doctor herself. She organized what the households had and supplemented from what she'd brought. She redistributed blankets, started fires properly, got broth heating. She moved between the cottages with the focused efficiency of someone who has managed crisis on inadequate resources before and knows that panic costs more than it gives. The doctor arrived 4 hours later, a man named Ellison, who was competent and harried, and visibly surprised to find the Duchess of Ashbourne in a tenant cottage with her sleeves rolled up and her hair escaping its pins. "Your Grace," he said carefully. "The Hollis girl first," she said. "Then the Penwick household." He went where she directed him. He did not argue. There are some people who make arguing feel beside the point, and Eleanor was one of them. She was there for 6 hours. She came back to Ashbourne Hall as the light was failing cold through, and carrying the distinct smell of illness and wood smoke, and the herb mixture she'd helped prepare in the 3rd cottage's kitchen. Nathaniel was in the entrance hall. He had been there by the look of him for some time. He looked at her coat, her hair, the state of her hands, and his expression went through several things very quickly before it settled on something that was entirely too controlled to be natural. "Mrs. Fairfax told me where you'd gone," he said. "I left a note," she said. "Yes." His voice was level, careful. "4 hours after you left." She understood the meaning of that. "I didn't expect it to take as long as it did." "Eleanor." He stopped. He looked at her very directly. "There is illness in those cottages, fever, the kind that—" He stopped again. "You cannot simply walk into a situation like that alone." "I wasn't alone. Mrs. Hollis was there, and Mrs. Croft came with me for part of it." She began unbuttoning her coat. "The Hollis girl needed help, Nathaniel. The old Penwick man needed help. Dr. Ellison is going back tomorrow, and I've arranged for supplies to be brought from—" "You organized all of this today," he said. "Not a question. In 6 hours, in 3 ill households, without telling anyone." "I told Mrs. Fairfax." "Mrs. Fairfax," he said, "is not I am." He stopped. He pressed 2 fingers to his forehead briefly. "I am your husband." She looked at him. Something in his face was raw in a way she hadn't seen before, and she understood suddenly that this was not about the absence of a note. "I didn't think you would worry," she said quietly. "That was a miscalculation," he said. The hall was very quiet. "I'm all right," she said. "I can see that." His voice was rough at the edge. "Now." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The supplies need to go out first thing tomorrow. I'll write the list tonight. Eleanor. He crossed to her. He took the coat from her hands, which she had been holding somewhat uselessly. He was close enough that she could see the exact degree of contained feeling in his face. Sit down. Eat something. The list can wait 1 hour. She blinked. It was not an expression she wore often. All right, she said. They ate together in the small dining room, not the formal one, and she told him what she'd found in the cottages, and what she'd done, and what needed to happen next. He listened with the focused attention she'd come to rely on, not performing interest, actually having it. He asked precise questions. He agreed to every resource she requested without negotiation. And then he said at the end of it, "You should have told me earlier." "I know," she said. "I'm used to handling things alone. You don't have to anymore." She looked at him across the table. He was looking back at her with an expression that was open in a way she'd had to work to earn access to, and it occurred to her not for the first time that this man had hidden himself so thoroughly for so long that even he didn't always recognize when he was letting her in. "I'll remember that," she said. She meant it. She went back the next day. And the day after that. The fever, it turned out, was not going to be resolved in a week. It moved slowly through the cluster of cottages, receding here, flaring there with the stubborn persistence of illness that has found a community without adequate defenses. Eleanor tracked it the way she tracked the household accounts, systematically, methodically, with careful notation of what was working and what was not. She organized a rotation of supplies. She spoke to Dr. Ellison every other day. She identified which families had the resources to manage and which ones needed direct support, and she directed the support without making anyone feel that receiving it was a humiliation. That last part was, she knew, the hardest part. The part most people with resources didn't bother with. Nathaniel began coming with her on the 4th day. He didn't announce this. He simply appeared at the door at the time she usually left in his outdoor coat and said, "Ellison sent word about the Penwick situation. I thought I should see it directly." She looked at him for a moment. "The Penwick cottage is the 3rd one," she said. "I'll show you." He came with her. He was at first quieter than she was in the cottages, more formal, carrying his title with him in the way that people who've always had power sometimes can't help doing. But he was observant. And he was uncomfortable in the right way, the way that comes from seeing something that should not be and not being able to unsee it. He spoke to the old Penwick man for nearly 20 minutes. She didn't interfere. She watched from the corner of the room as Nathaniel sat in a plain chair beside the old man's bed and talked to him the way men talk when they stop performing, directly, simply about the land and the cold and how the North Field had been in the old man's father's time. When they left, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "He's been on this estate for 53 years. "I know," Eleanor said, "and I didn't know his first name until today." She didn't fill the silence with reassurance. She let him carry it. "That needs to change," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You already knew it would. You knew it the moment you heard Mrs. Croft mention his name." "I suspected," she said. "How?" He was genuinely asking. "How do you know to listen for the things that other people have learned not to say?" She thought about it honestly. "Because I spent years being the person in the room that people had learned not to say things to," she said. "When you are consistently overlooked, you learn what overlooked looks like. You learn how people hide need, because they've been taught that need is a problem rather than a condition." She paused. "It's not a gift, Nathaniel. It's a wound that became useful." He stopped walking. She went 2 more steps before she realized and turned back. He was looking at her with something she didn't quite have a name for yet. "I am sorry," he said, "that you had to learn it that way." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Use it. That's the only way it means anything." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded once, and they walked on. The illness peaked at the end of January, and then Eleanor got sick. It started as a headache on a Tuesday evening, which she ignored because she always ignored headaches. By Wednesday morning, it was a heaviness in her chest that she told herself was tiredness. By Wednesday afternoon, she could not keep warm no matter how close she sat to the fire, which was the point at which Mrs. Fairfax found her in the sitting room and took one look at her and said with complete authority, "You are going to bed, Your Grace." "I have correspondence too. I will inform His Grace," said Mrs. Fairfax, as though this settled the matter entirely. It did settle the matter entirely, because Mrs. Fairfax went directly to Nathaniel's study, opened the door without knocking, which she had not done in 31 years of service, and said, "Your Grace, Her Grace is ill." Nathaniel was on his feet before she finished the sentence. He found Eleanor sitting on the edge of the bed in their room, still in her day dress, with the specific look of someone trying to assess whether they were actually ill or simply needed more sleep. He had learned to read her expressions with some accuracy by now, and what he read in this one, the faint lines of effort at the corners of her eyes, the way she was holding herself slightly more carefully than usual, told him she was worse than she was planning to admit. "Eleanor," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "You are the worst liar I have ever met," he said. "And I've spent years in rooms full of politicians." She almost smiled, then winced slightly, which she tried to hide. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed. He put his hand to her forehead the way she had put her hand to the Hollis girl's forehead 3 weeks ago. She was burning. "Right," he said. "Lie down." "I need to—" "Lie down," he said again. Not an order. Something quieter and more certain than an order. She lay down. He sent for Ellison. He told Mrs. Fairfax what he needed, and she had it ready before he finished speaking, because Mrs. Fairfax had spent 3 weeks watching her Duchess manage a health crisis in other people's households and had taken extremely detailed notes. Ellison came within 2 hours and confirmed what Nathaniel had already known. The same fever Eleanor had been fighting in the cottages had come for her. Not dangerously severe yet. But she was to rest completely. No exceptions, no correspondence, no household management, no getting up to help with things at 5 in the morning. "I'll see to the Hollis family's supplies," Ellison said at the door. "She organized the system well enough that it runs without her for a while. She thought of that, I think. Planned for it." Nathaniel looked at him. "She planned for being sick before she got sick. She planned for the possibility that something might prevent her from being there," Ellison said carefully. "I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about how she thinks." He left. Nathaniel went back to Eleanor's room. She was awake, which he'd expected because Eleanor with a fever was still more alert than most people at full health. "I need you to stop planning things," he said, "while you have a fever." "I'm not planning," she said. "I'm resting." "Your eyes are moving," he said. "You're not resting." "My eyes move when I rest." "Not like that." She looked at him, and despite the fever and the heaviness she was carrying, something in her expression shifted into the particular quality of directness that meant she was going to say something true. "I planned for the possibility of being incapacitated," she said, "because I have never been able to afford to assume I wouldn't be. Because when you are the only person managing something and you fail, the something fails. I've lived that. I wasn't going to let those families live it." He sat in the chair beside her bed. "You are not the only person managing things anymore," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I'm still learning what that means." He stayed. He had meetings he rescheduled and correspondence he delayed, and one conversation with Mr. Prentice that he had through the door of Eleanor's room while she was sleeping, because he did not want to be in a different part of the house. He would not have been able to fully explain why, except that the distance felt wrong in a way that had become impossible to dismiss. She slept badly the first night. The fever spiked somewhere after midnight, and she was half-conscious and not entirely coherent for several hours, and Nathaniel, who had sent the nightmaid away because he was not going to ask someone else to manage this, sat in the chair and watched her with the specific attentiveness of a man keeping vigil and trying not to acknowledge that that was what he was doing. At some point, near 3 in the morning, she said clearly and entirely without context, "The east wing guttering." He stared at her. What? It needs to be done before the rains. She was clearly not awake. I know, he said. I had it done. In December. Good, she said, and seemed to relax slightly. He leaned forward in the chair with his forearms on his knees and looked at her, at this woman who planned for her own incapacitation while she was getting sick, who worried about guttering in a fever dream, who had come into his house with one bag and no agenda, and changed almost every single thing about how it functioned without ever once asking for acknowledgement. He had been telling himself since Christmas that what he was feeling was gratitude, respect, the natural warmth that develops between two people who spend a great deal of time together and find they don't irritate each other. At 3 in the morning in the chair beside her bed, he stopped lying to himself. He was in love with her. He didn't say it. She was unconscious. The timing was not. But then there was no good timing for this particular realization. The realization that the thing you told yourself you didn't want has been happening anyway, quietly, steadily, with the patient inevitability of water finding its level. He sat in the chair. He stayed until morning. She recovered in 4 days, which was faster than Ellison expected, and exactly as fast as Mrs. Fairfax predicted, because Mrs. Fairfax had developed a comprehensive understanding of Eleanor's capacity for will over the past 2 months, and factored it into her estimates. On the 4th day, Eleanor appeared at breakfast. She was slightly thinner and slightly paler, and her hair was arranged with less precision than usual, and she sat down, poured her own tea, and reached for the household journal she'd apparently retrieved from the sitting room at some point. Nathaniel looked at her over his own cup. You were supposed to rest until tomorrow, he said. I feel better, she said. Ellison hasn't met me before this illness, she said. I'm telling you I'm better. You're telling me you're ready to work, he said. Those are not the same thing. She paused. She looked at him. He looked back steadily. You're right, she said, which surprised them both slightly. They're not the same thing. She put down the journal. How are the Hollis children? The youngest 2 are recovered. The eldest had a setback, but Ellison says she's past the worst of it. The Penwick man. Stable. I went yesterday. She was quiet for a moment. You went without me. You were ill. I know. She looked at him with an expression that was doing something more complicated than gratitude, but hadn't quite resolved itself into a name. Thank you. It needed to be done, he said. He heard himself say it and recognized it as exactly the thing she would have said, the practical framing she always used to deflect acknowledgement, and he almost laughed at himself for catching the habit. She noticed. Of course she noticed. You've started doing that, she said. Doing what? Saying it needed to be done when you mean something else. He met her eyes. And what do I mean? A pause. That you wanted to, she said. That it mattered to you. Not just because it was practical. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. That. The word sat between them in the morning quiet. And then before either of them could make something of it, the door opened, and Mr. Prentice appeared with a face that meant business. Your Grace, he said to Nathaniel. I apologize for the interruption. A letter has arrived from London, from the solicitors managing the inheritance clause. He paused. The pause was meaningful. There is a complication. Nathaniel went still. Eleanor looked at Prentice. What kind of complication? She asked. Prentice looked at her with the expression of a man deciding whether to include her or defer to the Duke, and then clearly decided accurately that deferring to anyone but Eleanor in matters of household importance was a mistake he should not make twice. There is a provision, he said, in the original inheritance clause that neither I nor His Grace were shown at the time of the initial reading. He looked at the letter in his hand. The title and estate pass securely only when an heir has been born. Not simply when the Duke has married. The marriage was a prerequisite, not a resolution. Eleanor turned to Nathaniel. He was looking at Prentice with an expression that was utterly calm and utterly unreadable. I know, he said. Prentice blinked. You? I've known since November. My own legal counsel uncovered it before the wedding. I didn't disclose it at the time because it didn't change my decision, and I didn't want it to." He stopped. "I didn't want Eleanor to believe she was being pressured beyond what I'd already asked her to accept." The room was very quiet. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "You knew before the wedding," she said, "that marriage alone wouldn't be enough." "Yes, and you married me anyway, without telling me the full terms." "I intended to tell you." His jaw was tight. "I was looking for the right time, and then things were—" He stopped. "There was no good time. That's not an excuse. It's the truth." Eleanor stood up. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to him for a moment, very still, which was always more alarming from Eleanor than raised voices would have been from anyone else. "You protected me from information," she said. "That was not your choice to make." "No," he said. "It wasn't. I told you on the day we met that I would not pretend to be something I wasn't. I asked the same from you." "I know. And you withheld something significant." "Yes." She turned around. He was looking at her with no defense in his face at all, which was the one thing that made it harder, rather than easier, to be angry at him. "I will not pretend this doesn't matter," she said. "I'm not asking you to. But I also—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly. "I understand why you did it. I don't agree with it, but I understand it." She looked at him very directly. "Don't do it again." "I won't. I mean that, Nathaniel. Whatever comes next, whatever the terms are, whatever it requires, you tell me. All of it. Immediately. We are either partners in this, or we are performing a marriage for an audience we don't owe anything to." "We are partners," he said, without hesitation. Prentice had gone very still near the door in the particular way of solicitors who are trying to be furniture. Eleanor looked at him. "The letter will need a formal response," she said. "Whatever the timeline is for the remaining provision, Mr. Prentice will need full authorization to act on my behalf, as well as His Grace's." She looked back at Nathaniel. "Agreed. Agreed," he said. Something in his expression had shifted, not relief. Something deeper than relief. The particular look of a man who has just seen the person he loves choose to stay. Prentice said carefully, "There is one other element in the letter." They both looked at him. "Your cousin," he said to Nathaniel. "Geoffrey Calder. He has retained his own legal counsel and has filed a formal inquiry challenging the validity of the marriage." The air in the room changed. "On what grounds?" Nathaniel said. "He claims the marriage was contracted under duress and without genuine consent, as Miss Hartwell." Prentice glanced at Eleanor with something like apology, as Her Grace had no meaningful alternative to accepting the arrangement given her financial circumstances. Eleanor laughed. It was not a bitter laugh. It was a short, genuine sound of genuine surprise at the audacity of it. Both Nathaniel and Prentice looked at her. "He's saying I was desperate enough to agree to anything," she said. "In essence," Prentice said, "and he thinks that makes the marriage invalid. He thinks it makes it contestable. There is a difference. He is—" Prentice chose his words carefully, looking for any thread he can find. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel was looking at her with a quality of stillness that she recognized now as the outer surface of something very close to rage. "He is wrong," Nathaniel said. "On every level." "I know that," Eleanor said. "You know that. Mr. Prentice knows that." She paused. "But Geoffrey Calder is going to need to be shown." "How?" She looked at him steadily. "The same way I showed Lady Dunmore's dinner party," she said. "By being undeniably real." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Whatever he does next, we face it together." "Yes," she said, "we do." And the thing that had been growing quietly in the space between them through breakfast tables and cottage visits and fever nights and guttering and Christmas mornings and all the small, uncelebrated moments that make a real life, that thing had a shape now. Solid and specific and no longer possible to mistake for anything other than what it was. Neither of them said it yet, but they both knew. Jeffrey Calder arrived at Ashbourne Hall on a Thursday morning without invitation. That was the first thing. He simply appeared a carriage on the drive, a knock at the door, and then Jeffrey himself in the entrance hall, acting as though the house already belonged to him, and he was simply choosing to be gracious about the current occupants. He was 41 years old, handsome in the way that men are handsome when they've spent a lifetime relying on it, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the specific ease of someone who has never had to earn a room's attention because he'd always simply taken it. Mrs. Fairfax came to find Eleanor immediately. Eleanor was in the library going through correspondence with the focused efficiency that had become her morning habit. She looked up when Mrs. Fairfax appeared in the doorway, read the housekeeper's expression in approximately 2 seconds, and set her pen down. "How long has he been here?" she asked. "5 minutes, Your Grace." He asked for his grace. "Where is his grace?" "Riding the North Field. He's not expected back until noon." Eleanor stood up. She straightened her dress. She was wearing something plain, as she almost always was, a deep blue wool that was well made and entirely without pretension. She did not go to change. She did not send for anyone. She walked to the entrance hall herself. Jeffrey Calder turned when he heard her step, and his expression did the thing she had been watching people's expressions do since November, that fractional recalibration, that small visible adjustment as he encountered someone who was not what he'd expected and was working out how to respond. "Mr. Calder," she said. "Not Your Grace, not sir." The precise omission of every honorific she could have offered chosen deliberately. "Your Grace." His smile was the kind that didn't reach anything. "What a pleasure to finally meet you. I had hoped to see Nathaniel, but perhaps you and I might—" "My husband is not here," she said. "He'll be back by noon. You're welcome to wait." "Ah." He glanced around the hall in a way designed to communicate possession. "The house looks well. You've been busy." "The house was always well managed," she said. "I've simply continued the standard." "Of course." He turned the smile back on her. "I hope I haven't come at an inconvenient time. I wanted to. I thought it was important that we meet. Properly, given the current situation." "The legal challenge you've filed," she said. "Not a question." He paused. The smile adjusted slightly. "I see Nathaniel keeps you informed." "We don't keep things from each other," she said. "Would you like tea while you wait?" It was such a normal, courteous thing to say that it clearly wrong-footed him, which was exactly why she'd said it. Men like Jeffrey Calder expected either hostility or deference, and she offered him neither. She offered him the ordinary hospitality of a woman entirely secure in her own home. "Yes," he said after a beat. "Thank you." She had him shown to the smaller drawing room, not the formal one. The smaller one, which was comfortable but not impressive, where the message was, "You are a guest, not a dignitary." She sent tea. She did not join him. She went back to the library and wrote a note to Nathaniel, which she gave to a groom with instructions to ride out immediately. Nathaniel was back in 45 minutes. She heard him come in, heard him speak to Mrs. Fairfax, and then heard his footsteps on the stairs, not toward the drawing room but toward the library. He came through the door and looked at her first before anything else. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm perfectly fine," she said. "He arrived 45 minutes ago. I put him in the small drawing room. He wanted to see you." "What did he say to you?" "Nothing significant. He smiled too much and looked at the house like he was deciding where to put his things." She paused. "He's testing something. I'm not sure what yet." Nathaniel's jaw was tight. "I should have had Prentice send a formal refusal of—" "No," she said. "This is better. Let him come here. Let him see what this is." She looked at Nathaniel steadily. "Go and speak to him. I'll join you in 10 minutes." He blinked. "You want to be there. I insist on it," she said. "He filed a challenge against our marriage. I am part of this marriage. I will be in the room." Something crossed his face, not surprise exactly. More like the ongoing incremental experience of being with someone who consistently did not do the expected thing. 10 minutes, he said. 10 minutes, she confirmed, and looked back at her correspondence. He shook his head slightly, almost to himself, and went to meet his cousin. She heard Jeffrey's voice first when she came down the corridor, the particular carrying quality of a man who had never had to lower it to be heard. "Can't imagine why you'd choose to." And then she opened the door, and the sentence ended. Nathaniel was standing near the window. Jeffrey was seated, which was interesting. He'd taken the better chair, which was a small power move, but Nathaniel's standing made him look like the visitor, and from the slight irritation on Jeffrey's face, he'd realized it. Eleanor came in and sat down without waiting to be invited. She sat in the chair closest to the door, a deliberate choice, because it put her slightly behind Jeffrey's line of sight and required him to turn to address her, which meant he couldn't watch both of them at once. "Your Grace," Jeffrey said, turning to her with the smile again. "I was just saying to Nathaniel, I hope there are no hard feelings about the legal matter. It's purely a procedural question." "What procedure," she said pleasantly, "involves accusing a woman of not being able to consent freely to her own marriage?" A beat. "It's not the filing is a formality, it simply raises. It raises the question of whether I was desperate enough to agree to anything," she said. "We've been through this. What would you like to know? Ask me directly." Jeffrey looked at her. Something shifted in his assessment of the situation. "All right," he said, directly. "Did Nathaniel pressure you into this marriage?" "No." "Did you have meaningful alternatives?" "Mr. Calder," she said, "I am a woman who managed a household through debt, illness, and poverty, without once asking anyone for help I hadn't earned. I did not marry your cousin because I had no other options. I married him because he asked me an honest question, and I gave him an honest answer. I understand that's a concept that may be unfamiliar to you." The room went very still. Jeffrey looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked back at him with an expression that communicated with complete clarity that he would not be intervening. "You are," Jeffrey said slowly, "not what I expected." "No," Eleanor said. "I'm not." A pause. Then Jeffrey did something she hadn't anticipated. He laughed, genuinely. A short, surprised sound that seemed to come out of him against his will. "All right," he said. He looked at Nathaniel. "I withdraw the filing." Nathaniel went still. "Jeffrey, I withdraw it," Jeffrey said again. He sounded for the first time like someone who was not performing. "Look, I'm not a good man. I know that. I've made a disaster of everything I've been given. I filed that challenge because I was angry, and because I don't know what I wanted." He paused. "But I'm not going to build a case on the argument that she didn't know her own mind. Anyone who spends 10 minutes in a room with her can see that's absurd." Eleanor looked at him. She had not expected this. She did not let that show. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. "Don't thank me," he said. "I'm still angry about the estate. I'm still going to be difficult." He stood. He straightened his coat. "But I'll be difficult honestly, rather than that." He nodded to them both. "I'll see myself out." He left. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Nathaniel said, "I have never seen him do that." "He's not entirely lost," Eleanor said. "He's just never been spoken to directly before." She paused. "Someone should probably do it more often." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "Someone should probably do a great many things more often," he said, and the weight he put on those words was not about Jeffrey at all. She met his eyes. "Yes," she said quietly. "They should." February moved through Ashbourne in fits and starts, cold, and then briefly mild, and then cold again, the kind of month that couldn't decide what it was. The legal challenge was formally withdrawn within the week. Prentice handled the paperwork with barely concealed relief and sent Eleanor a note saying simply, "Well done, Your Grace." She put it in her correspondence file and didn't mention it to anyone. The Tennant families recovered. The Hollis children came to the hall at Eleanor's quiet invitation on a Saturday afternoon, the 4-year-old still somewhat pale, but upright and curious. And she spent 2 hours with them in the kitchen, with Mrs. Doyle, making something that was supposed to be biscuits and was enthusiastically imprecise. Nathaniel came to find her afterward and stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the flower on her dress and the deliberate mess on the table, and the way the eldest Hollis child, who was 11 and reserved and had clearly decided to be watchful, was talking to Eleanor with the ease of someone who had decided without any ceremony to trust her. He stood there longer than he needed to. Eleanor looked up and found him watching. She raised an eyebrow. He shook his head slightly, as if answering a question he'd asked himself, and went away. He had been doing this more often, coming to find her, and then not saying what he'd come to say. She noticed it the way she noticed everything catalogued. It held, it waited. She was good at waiting. She was less good, she was discovering at waiting for this particular thing, which was new. She was not accustomed to wanting. The dinner invitation from London arrived in the second week of February. Not a local gathering, not the Dunmore dinner or any of the county events they had navigated with measured success. This was a formal invitation from Lord and Lady Ashton, a name that meant something very specific in English society. The Ashtons were not simply wealthy. They were the kind of family whose opinions set a standard. An invitation from them was a message to everyone else. Lady Ashton had written herself, which was notable. The invitation was addressed to both the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne, and contained a handwritten line at the bottom. "We have heard a great deal about your wife, Nathaniel. We look forward to meeting her ourselves." Nathaniel brought the invitation to Eleanor. She read it twice. "Lady Ashton," she said. "She runs approximately a third of London society from a house in Mayfair," he said. "She has made and ruined reputations with less effort than most people put into selecting a hat. And she's heard about me. Apparently." "What has she heard?" He sat down across from her. "From what Prentice has gathered, the Dunmore dinner, your management of the fever outbreak, Geoffrey's withdrawal of the legal challenge." He paused. "You have been making an impression, Eleanor. You simply haven't been in the room to notice it." She looked at the invitation. She wants to see if the impression matches the person. Yes. And if it doesn't, then she will communicate that to everyone she knows, and the narrative becomes the Duke's unconventional choice doesn't hold up under real scrutiny. He said it flatly, without softening it. He'd learned she preferred the unvarnished version. She appreciated that even now. "And if it does," she said, "then no one in England will question this marriage again." He paused. "Including Geoffrey. Including anyone else who has been waiting for it to collapse." Eleanor set the invitation down. She looked at him with the particular directness that meant she was about to say something she'd been thinking for longer than the conversation. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right." "Why does this matter to you?" She held his gaze. "Not the estate. Not the inheritance clause. Not what Lady Ashton thinks. Why does what happens to me in that room matter to you personally?" He held very still. She pressed. "Because you didn't need to bring this to me yourself. You could have had Prentice handle it. You came to find me. You sat down. You are looking at me right now like the answer to that question is not the answer you planned to have when you married me." The silence was long. "No," he said finally. "It isn't." "Then what is the answer?" He looked at her, really looked the way he did when he wasn't managing his own expression, when the wall he'd spent years perfecting had something coming through it that he couldn't quite hold back. "You know what it is," he said. "I want to hear you say it." A beat. Two. "Eleanor." His voice was low and careful, the way voices get when the thing being said is being treated like something that could break. "I have been trying for 2 months to maintain an appropriate distance from a conclusion that I reached in January at 3 a.m. in the chair beside your bed while you had a fever and were talking about guttering." She didn't move. "I told myself it was gratitude," he said. "I told myself it was respect. I told myself that what I was feeling was the natural consequence of proximity and that it would settle. Find its level." He looked at her steadily. "It has not settled." "No," she said quietly. "It hasn't. I don't know how to. I am not—" He stopped. He started again. "The last time I let myself care about someone in this way, it was used against me, and I built a significant amount of architecture around making sure that didn't happen again. And then you came in and started noticing the guttering, and asking the servants if they'd had lunch, and sitting in my chair as though it had always been yours, and—" He stopped. The architecture didn't hold. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up. She walked to where he was sitting. She stood in front of him and waited until he looked up at her. "I told you," she said, "when we first met that I would not love you out of gratitude. That if I came to love you, it would be because you'd earned it." He said nothing. Waited. "You have been earning it," she said, "since December 23rd. He stared at her. "The Christmas morning," she said, "when you sat down beside the fire and said, 'Sit with me,' and meant it. You've been earning it every day since then." She paused. "I have been trying," she said, "to be rational about this. To be careful. I am very good at being careful." "I know," he said. "I don't want to be careful about this anymore." He stood up. They were very close. The particular close of two people who have been maintaining a deliberate distance and have simultaneously, without coordination, stopped. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes," she said simply. Not an answer to anything he'd asked. An answer to everything. He kissed her, not carefully, not tentatively. The way you do something when you've been trying not to for too long, and the trying has finally exhausted itself with the full weight of everything that had been building since a Thursday in November when she'd said, "I suppose we should go home," and meant it in a way that made a house into one. When they stepped back from each other, neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Eleanor said, "We should accept the Ashton invitation." He laughed. A real laugh surprised out of him completely. "Yes," he said, "we should." The Ashton dinner was in the third week of February. Lady Ashton was 70 years old, small, sharp-eyed, and wearing more jewelry than Eleanor had ever seen on one person outside of a portrait. She received them in a drawing room full of people who were all pretending very hard not to look at Eleanor while looking at her constantly. Lady Ashton took both of Eleanor's hands when they were introduced. She held them for a moment, looking at Eleanor with the direct assessment of someone who had been evaluating people for 50 years and was very good at it. "So," she said, "you're the woman who fixed the Ashbourne guttering." Eleanor heard Nathaniel standing slightly behind her stifle something. "Among other things," Eleanor said. Lady Ashton smiled. It reached her eyes, which told Eleanor everything she needed to know. "My husband," Lady Ashton said, "told me in 1831 that he needed a sensible woman, not a performance. I told him he had no idea what he was asking for." She squeezed Eleanor's hands once and released them. "Come and sit with me. I want to know how you managed the fever outbreak with Ellison. He's a good doctor, but he makes terrible decisions under pressure." Eleanor let herself be steered toward a sofa. Nathaniel watched her go. Lord Ashton materialized at his elbow, a large, genial man who radiated the particular ease of someone who had been married for 40 years to a woman who ran everything and had found it completely agreeable. "She'll be fine," Lord Ashton said. "I know," Nathaniel said. "Lady Ashton doesn't take to most people." "I know that too. But she does take to people who are simply themselves without apology." He glanced at Nathaniel with the specific look of an older man who has watched a great many younger ones figure things out the hard way. "You chose well." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "I did." And the way he said it was not about the estate or the inheritance clause or the social necessity of having a wife who could hold her own in a room like this. Across the room, Eleanor was apparently saying something that made Lady Ashton actually laugh, a genuine sound that turned several heads. Nathaniel watched his wife make an ally out of the most influential woman in London in under 6 minutes, and felt something move in him that had no name yet, but was somewhere between awe and the specific helpless feeling of being entirely undone. They drove home from London in the late evening. The coach was dark and warm, and they were close together in the way you end up close in a small space, and outside the window, the lights of the city thinned to road and fields, and then the familiar shapes of the county. Eleanor was quiet, in the particular way she was quiet when she was thinking rather than tired. Lady Ashton invited us back, she said eventually. In March, she's hosting something for the Ladies' Medical Benevolent Society. I heard, he said. She wants you specifically. She wants us, Eleanor corrected. She said she told me something interesting, actually. She paused. She said that she and Lord Ashton had a contracted marriage in 1830, that her family needed the connection and his family needed the money, and they were both quite clear-eyed about it. She said the first year was very efficient, very polite. She looked at him in the dark. She looked at. She said she fell in love with him on a Tuesday in their second year because he gave up a seat at a particularly important parliamentary vote to come home early because she was ill, and he never told anyone, and she only found out by accident. Nathaniel was very still. She said the thing that made her love him, Eleanor continued, wasn't anything grand. It was that he chose her when he didn't have to, when no one was watching. The carriage moved through the dark. Eleanor, he said. I know, she said. I know it was January. The chair beside the bed. I know you stayed. He turned to look at her. She was already looking at him. You weren't supposed to know, he said. I always know, she said. I told you that at the beginning. He reached for her hand in the dark. She let him take it. I love you, he said, clear and simple and without architecture around it. She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of uncertainty, the quiet of someone receiving something they have wanted for a while and taking a second to let it be real. I love you, she said. I have been fairly sure of it since Christmas morning. Since Christmas morning, he repeated with the specific quality of someone doing slightly painful arithmetic. That was 2 months ago. I'm careful, she said. I told you that. You also told me, he said, that you didn't want to be careful anymore. I said that this afternoon. I know. I'm suggesting that you could have potentially Nathaniel. She squeezed his hand. I'm telling you now. He lifted her hand and held it for a moment, and outside the window, Ashbourne's fields were beginning the dark shapes of the land. They both knew the land that had been cold and orderly and silent before she came, and was none of those things anymore. There's one more thing, she said. What? She looked at him steadily. Her expression in the dark was impossible to fully read, but he had learned enough of her to catch the particular quality that meant something significant was coming. I think, she said carefully, that the inheritance clause may be closer to resolution than either of us has acknowledged. He looked at her, in the dark, and understood. He said nothing for a long moment. Are you certain? He said. Not yet, she said. But I will be soon. He looked at her face, this woman who had arrived with one bag and no agenda, and had become in the space of a few months so thoroughly the center of everything he was, that he couldn't quite locate where she ended and his life began. Eleanor, he said. I know, she said. Whatever happens, she agreed. Together. He held her hand in the dark all the way home, and when the lights of Ashbourne Hall appeared through the carriage window, warm in the February night, the east wing solid, and repaired the guttering clear. The house that had been silent for years, glowing with something that had not been there before, and had no precise name. He thought that whatever he had been looking for, when he sent Prentice out to find him a sensible woman, with no interest in impressing people, he had found something so far beyond it, that the original search felt like a small and accidental miracle. He had asked for practicality. He had been given everything. She was certain 3 weeks later. Eleanor told Nathaniel on a Wednesday morning before breakfast, because she had never seen the point of waiting for the right moment, when the right moment was simply the one where you had something true to say. She found him in the library, where she found him most mornings now, because they had both, without discussing it, shifted their routines toward each other in the way that people do when the distance between them has stopped making sense. She came in. She closed the door. She stood in front of his desk and looked at him with the expression he had learned to read as her version of significant, not dramatic, not performed, just very still and very clear. It's confirmed, she said. He put down his pen. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of moment where a great many things move through a person too quickly to name individually. Then he stood up. He came around the desk. He took her face in his hands with a gentleness that surprised them both, and he looked at her as though he was trying to memorize something. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm perfectly well," she said. How do you feel?" "Nathaniel, I feel fine. I feel—" She stopped. Something moved across her face that she didn't quite manage to contain. "I feel like something very important has happened." "Yes," he said. "It has." He kissed her forehead. He stayed there for a moment, his forehead against hers, both of them standing very still in the library, where they had first met, and where by some logic that felt almost deliberate, everything continued to happen. "I need to write to Prentice," she said. "Not yet," he said. "The legal—" "Not yet," he said again quietly. "Just 1 minute, just this." She stopped. She let herself have the minute. It was the right call. She knew it was the right call, because she could feel in the particular silence of those 60 seconds something completing itself, not ending, completing the way a circle closes and becomes something whole that it wasn't before. Then she said, "All right, now Prentice." He laughed, and it was the laugh she liked best, the one that came out of him fully without management, the one she'd been drawing out of him more frequently since February, and that still felt like something earned every time. The news moved carefully, and then all at once. Prentice was informed. The family solicitors were informed. The legal documentation that established the secure transfer of the Ashbourne title and estate, the paperwork that had been the engine of the entire arrangement since the beginning, was filed within the week. Geoffrey Calder was informed by letter. He did not respond immediately. That took 3 days. When his response came, it was a single line which Eleanor read aloud to Nathaniel at breakfast. "Congratulations. I suppose I shall have to ruin some other property." And then below that, in what looked like a separate decision made after the first one, "I mean that genuinely. Congratulations." Nathaniel looked at the letter for a moment. "Both lines," Eleanor said. "Yes," he said. "Both lines." She put the letter down. "I think your cousin is more complicated than you've given him credit for." "I think my cousin," Nathaniel said, "has met you twice and is reconsidering a significant number of things." "You might invite him here," she said. "Properly, not for any legal reason, just—" She paused. "People become what they're treated as. He's been treated as a disaster for so long he's learned to perform it." Nathaniel looked at her. "You want to rehabilitate Geoffrey. I want to invite him to dinner," she said. "What he does with it is his own business." He shook his head in the way he did when she had said something that was so precisely herself that arguing with it felt beside the point. "I'll write to him," he said. "Good." She picked up her tea. "Now, the East Cottage roof. Mrs. Fairfax says it's been patched twice and needs proper attention before spring." "I spoke to the estate manager yesterday," he said. "He's bringing someone in next week." She looked at him with something that was satisfaction, and more than satisfaction. He had learned to notice things. He had been learning since January, since the Penwick man, since the Hollis children, since the Thursday mornings when she came to breakfast, and he had started arriving earlier just to be there when she did. He had been paying attention not because it was expected of him, but because she had made the world outside his own routine visible. And once you could see it, you couldn't stop. "The Northfield fence," she said. "Done." "The arrangement with Dr. Ellison for the quarterly cottage visits. Signed last week. He'll begin in April." She set down her teacup. "You've been busy," she said. "I had a good example," he said simply. She looked at him across the breakfast table. The morning light was coming through the windows, and they had been doing this sitting here talking about everything and nothing. Building a life out of the ordinary materials of days for 4 months, and she could not quite locate the point at which it had become the thing she looked forward to most. She suspected it was sometime around the East Wing guttering. Spring announced itself slowly, and then completely the way it does in the English countryside, and Ashbourne Hall changed with it in ways both practical and not. The gardens, which had been maintained to a standard of precise and somewhat joyless perfection under the previous arrangement, began to look like something different. Still kept, still beautiful, but with additions that hadn't been there before. A kitchen garden that Eleanor had proposed, and the head gardener had embraced with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been wanting to suggest it for years and hadn't thought to. Sections that had been given over to decorative formality for decades were replanted with things that were useful as well as beautiful. The changes were noticed, not just at Ashbourne, throughout the county, through the network of people who talk, because that's what people do. The story of the Duke of Ashbourne's unconventional marriage had been shifting for months, from curiosity to intrigue to something approaching respect. Lady Ashton had seen to a significant portion of that. After the February dinner, Lady Ashton had returned to London and said things about Eleanor Hartwell to people who repeated them to other people, and what she said was not that the new Duchess was charming or accomplished or well-dressed. What she said was, "She is the most genuinely capable woman I have encountered in 20 years, and Nathaniel Whitmore has either the best judgment in England or the best luck, and I'm not sure which is more impressive." Coming from Lady Ashton, that was approximately equivalent to a royal endorsement. The invitations that began arriving at Ashbourne Hall in March bore no resemblance to the careful, slightly pitying overtures of November. These were real invitations from people who wanted Eleanor's company, rather than simply wanted to evaluate her. She accepted some, she declined others. She made no attempt to be everywhere, which was, Lady Ashton told her approvingly at their second meeting, the most sophisticated social strategy available. The people who want to be seen everywhere, Lady Ashton said, have nothing worth seeing. You have somewhere to be. That is the difference. Eleanor considered that. "I have a kitchen garden to oversee," she said. Lady Ashton laughed so hard she had to set down her teacup. 10. April brought Geoffrey. He arrived with actual advance notice this time, a letter, then a confirmation, then the carriage on the drive at a time he'd specified. He came alone without his usual studied carelessness, dressed somewhat more soberly than Eleanor remembered. She met him at the door, herself again. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at her differently, specifically at the visible evidence of the pregnancy which she had stopped trying to conceal because she had never seen the point of it. "Congratulations are perhaps more appropriate now than they were on paper," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Come in. Nathaniel's in the library." She walked him there herself, which she didn't have to do. She did it deliberately, the same way she'd done everything with Geoffrey, deliberately, with the understanding that how you treat a person communicates what you believe them to be capable of. She left the two cousins together. She did not know exactly what they said. She didn't ask. She had learned among the many things this marriage had taught her that some things need to happen without a manager. What she knew was that Geoffrey stayed for dinner, that he came back into the sitting room afterward with something slightly different in his face, less performance, more just person, that he spoke to her directly and with something that was approaching genuine rather than theatrical, asking about the Tennant families, about the Ellison arrangement, about the kitchen garden. She answered him. She asked him in turn about the property he'd mentioned, a smaller estate in the north that he'd apparently been trying to salvage rather than sell. "I don't know anything about management," he said with the specific honesty of someone who'd recently decided that pretending otherwise was too exhausting. "I know someone who could help you," she said. "A land agent named Forsyth. He's worked with 3 failing estates in the last decade and turned all of them around. I'll write to him if you'd like." Geoffrey looked at her. "Why would you do that?" "Because you withdrew the legal challenge," she said. "And because you're family. And because I find people who've decided to actually try considerably more interesting than people who've given up." He was quiet for a moment. "You are," he said, "nothing like what I expected." "I know," she said. "You've mentioned that." He smiled. It was a real one. "I'll take the introduction to Forsyth," he said. "I'll write tomorrow," she said. The thing that nobody who had watched the story from the outside fully understood, and many people watched it because it was the kind of story that was hard not to watch, was that the transformation at Ashbourne Hall was not Eleanor's doing. Not entirely. It was what happened when two people who were each incomplete in specific and complementary ways stopped pretending they were fine and started being honest about where the gaps were. Eleanor had capacity without security. She had always been capable of managing anything she was given. But she had been managing from a position of constant precarity, where every decision had consequences she couldn't fully absorb if they went wrong. She had learned not to want too much because wanting required safety to land in. Nathaniel had security without warmth. He had inherited an institution and managed it with complete competence and absolute emotional efficiency, which meant he had a perfectly functioning household and no idea what it was for. Together they made something that was neither of those incomplete things. She gave him the capacity to actually look at what he had, the people, the land, the responsibility, and to feel the weight of it as meaning rather than burden. He gave her the ground to stand on while she did what she'd always been able to do, but without the constant fear of falling. It was not romantic in the way that stories usually require romance to be. It was not dramatic in the way that love is supposed to be dramatic. It was the specific, unglamorous, entirely sustaining love of two people who had chosen each other honestly and kept choosing each other every day in the small and unremarked ways that real love actually lives. Nathaniel, when he thought about it, which he did more than he would have admitted to anyone except Eleanor, and he admitted most things to Eleanor, now thought that the wedding had been the least significant moment of the entire story. It was the ceremony. It was the form. The actual marriage was built in the library, and at the breakfast table, and in the chair beside the bed, at 3 a.m, and on the path between the hall and the Hollis cottage, and in the carriage home from London, in the dark. It was built in every conversation they'd had, where she'd refused to let him pretend, and he'd refused to let her manage everything alone. It was built the morning she'd come into the library, and said it's confirmed, and he'd put down his pen, and taken her face in his hands, and asked if she was all right, before he asked anything else. The baby arrived in October in the same stone house where everything else had happened, and was a boy, and was healthy, and was placed in Eleanor's arms by Dr. Ellison, who had driven through the night to be there, and looked somewhat undone by the whole experience, in the way that doctors do, when they have been competent and efficient through everything, and then are suddenly confronted by the fact of a new person in the world. Nathaniel was there. He had been there for every hour of it, which was not common for men of his position and time, and he had stayed because Eleanor had not asked him to leave, and he had not been capable of being anywhere else. When Ellison put the baby in her arms and stepped back, Eleanor looked at her son for a long moment without speaking. Then she looked at Nathaniel. He was looking at this baby with an expression she had never seen on his face before, completely open, entirely unguarded, all the architecture gone, as though it had never been there. "Hello," he said softly, to the baby. Just that. Eleanor looked at him saying hello to their son, with his whole face undefended, and she felt something move in her chest that was too large and too complete to name, and for the first time in a very long time. Perhaps the first time since before her father died, and the debts came and the managing began. She let herself cry. Not from sadness, not from relief, from the specific overwhelm of having more than you'd learned to allow yourself to expect. Nathaniel looked up immediately. "Eleanor, I'm fine," she said, crying. "I'm completely fine." I told you," she said, "that if I came to love you, it would be because you earned it." She looked at him through the particular blurriness of tears holding their son. "You have been earning it every single day. I just wanted you to know I notice." He crossed to the bed. He sat beside her. He put one arm around her carefully and looked at the baby with her, and he did not say anything for a while because there was nothing that needed to be said. Eventually he said quietly, "What should we call him?" She considered. They had discussed names, but reached no conclusion, which was unlike Eleanor, and which she suspected was because she had been in her own private way unwilling to name something before it existed. "James," she said. "For your father." He was very still. "And Arthur," she continued. "For mine." He turned to look at her. James Arthur Whitmore, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. His voice was not entirely steady. That's exactly right. Mrs. Fairfax retired 3 years later at her own timing and entirely on her own terms after training her replacement under Eleanor's direction with the methodical thoroughness of someone passing on something that mattered. On her last day, she came to find Eleanor in the sitting room that had long since become the operational center of the household, the room where the journals lived and the correspondence happened, and where James, at 3 years old, had claimed a corner for himself with his blocks and his periodically disruptive opinions. Mrs. Fairfax stood in the doorway and looked at the room. The organized activity of it, the warmth of it, the way it looked like a place where people actually lived rather than a stage set for the performance of domestic order. "Your Grace," she said. Eleanor looked up. "I wanted to say—" Mrs. Fairfax paused. 34 years of practiced dignity, and her voice was not quite steady. "When you arrived here, I was prepared to be respectful and patient, and to wait for you to lose interest in the details." "I know," Eleanor said. "You did not lose interest in the details." "No. What you did to this house." She stopped. She started again. "I have been part of 3 dukes' households. I have never seen a house become a home in the way this one did. Not from the top down, not from the outside in. From the middle outward. From the kitchen and the linen cupboard and the question of whether the hall boy had had his lunch." She looked at Eleanor directly. "You didn't fix this place. You showed it what it was supposed to be." Eleanor stood up. She crossed the room and took both of Mrs. Fairfax's hands in hers, the way Lady Ashton had taken hers, and held them. "You were part of that," she said. "You knew what this house needed before I arrived. You just needed someone to work with." Mrs. Fairfax pressed her lips together briefly. "Will you be all right without me?" "I will be considerably less organized," Eleanor said. "But yes, we'll be all right." They held on for a moment longer. Then Mrs. Fairfax straightened, reclaimed her dignity with the ease of long practice, said, "Very good, Your Grace," in a tone that contained everything, and walked out. Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched her go. James appeared at her elbow blocks in hand, with the implacable urgency of a 3-year-old who has decided that whatever just happened is over and something else needs to happen now. "Mama," he said, "come build." She looked down at him, at his dark eyes, which were his father's, and his particular direct expression, which was not exactly either of theirs, but something new that had come out of the combination of them. She thought not for the first time that he was going to be someone remarkable in ways that had nothing to do with his title. "All right," she said. "Show me what we're building." Nathaniel found them on the floor of the sitting room an hour later, surrounded by an architectural project that had begun as a tower and evolved into something considerably more ambitious. He stood in the doorway and looked at his wife and his son, and he did not announce himself for a moment. He had been doing this more often in the last 3 years, coming to a doorway and simply being in it for a moment before entering, because the view from the doorway was something he didn't want to rush past. Because the view from the doorway was his life, actual and present, and more than he had thought to want when he'd sent Prentice out to find him a sensible woman who wouldn't turn marriage into a performance. James spotted him first. "Papa, come build." "What are we building?" he asked, coming in sitting on the floor with the ease of a man who had rebuilt his relationship with the concept of dignity somewhere around the first Christmas. "It was a tower," Eleanor said. "It's become something more complicated." "It usually does," he said, looking at her, meaning something else. She looked back at him. She had always known when he meant something else. She had known it from the first conversation in the library, from the moment she had looked at him directly, and seen someone trying very hard not to let anyone see him clearly. She had seen him clearly from the beginning. "The East Garden wall," she said. "What about it?" "It's cracking again, lower section near the gate." He sighed. "I'll speak to the groundskeeper." "I already did," she said. "He'll start Monday." He looked at her. "Then why did you—" "I like seeing if you remember," she said. He shook his head, but he was smiling fully, completely, the way he had learned to smile in a house that had learned to feel things again. "You are," he said, "the most exhausting person I have ever known." "I know," she said cheerfully. "Hand me that block." He handed her the block. James immediately commandeered it. They built something on the floor of the sitting room that was structurally improbable and completely theirs, and outside the window, the spring fields of Ashbourne ran to the horizon under a sky that was exactly the right blue, and the house around them had the settled, inhabited feeling of a place that knew what it was for. Years later, people who came to Ashbourne Hall would hear the story, because stories like this one have a persistence that outlasts the people inside them. They would hear about the November when the Duke had rejected every suitable candidate and chosen a country scholar's daughter with one bag and no agenda. They would hear about Lady Dunmore's dinner and the fever outbreak, and Geoffrey's legal challenge and Lady Ashton's endorsement. They would hear about the wedding in the small chapel and the Christmas morning and the chair beside the bed at 3 in the morning. They would put the pieces together and conclude that it was a story about an unconventional choice that turned out well. They would be right, but they would be missing the most important part. The most important part was not the choice. The most important part was everything that came after the choice, every morning at the breakfast table, every difficult conversation conducted honestly, every small and unremarked act of someone choosing the other person when no one was watching, and nothing required it. The Duke who wanted a practical arrangement, and the woman who wanted to be seen clearly for what she actually was, had made something that was neither practical nor romantic in the usual senses of either word. They had made something true. And the truth of it, the daily unheroic sustaining truth of two people who had found each other by accident and chosen each other on purpose, was the thing that lasted. Long after the inheritance clause was resolved, and the legal challenges were withdrawn, and the society dinners were navigated, and the East Wing guttering was repaired for the final time. What remained was simply this: a man who had learned to say, "I don't know honestly," and a woman who had learned to want something without fear, and the life they had built together in the space between those two things. Eleanor Hartwell had not come to Ashbourne Hall to transform anyone. She had come because she believed in honest agreements, and she had made one. But she had transformed it anyway, the way honest people transform things, not by forcing them into a different shape, but by being so consistently, uncompromisingly real that everything around them has no choice but to become real too. The Duke of Ashbourne had spent his entire life managing for safety. He had found something immeasurably better. He had found someone who made safety feel like the least interesting thing a life could be built on, and who had shown him in the daily and unremarkable and extraordinary way of real love that the only foundation worth building on was the one you chose together every morning without ceremony, without an audience, and without end.